From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
This is Middle East Focus, the Middle East Institute's podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy. I am Intissar Fakir. The Russian invasion of Ukraine that started almost a year ago has jeopardized European energy supplies and generated a major reckoning on energy security in Europe. As a result, we have seen various efforts to diversify away from a heavy reliance on Russian gas and oil. These efforts have involved increasing imports from energy producers in the Maghreb region, including Algeria and Libya. It's also impacting energy cooperation with potential renewable energy producers, such as Morocco and Egypt, which is also a major gas supplier. To help us understand what that relationship looks like, its broader geopolitical context, and the specific implications for climate change and clean energy, I'm delighted to welcome today's guest, Alberto Rizzi, a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and an expert on the geopolitics of infrastructure and energy in the Mediterranean region. Alberto has an extensive background in research, having worked at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, the European Army Interoperability Center, the China-Italy Foundation, and the Italian Embassy in Tallinn. Welcome, Alberto.
Hello, welcome. Nice. Thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you with us today. And I thought maybe we can start our conversation with you kind of helping us understand the broader picture of the EU relationship with energy producers in the Maghreb. How has that relationship changed, particularly over the past year?
Well, the EU has a rather long history of energy partnership with the Maghreb countries. The first pipelines were proposed back in the 1960s with the first feasibility studies, and then the structured with a comprehensive energy partnership. And until a few years ago, actually, Maghreb countries were among the major suppliers of gas to Europe, on par with Norway and Russia. What has changed was that after the Arab Springs and the waves of political instability in the region, Europe has somehow grown concerned about it and has focused more on Russia, which at the time was perceived as a more politically stable and generally a more reliable energy partner. The thing is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has suddenly changed completely the picture, and here we come to the changes that we have witnessed the last year, because the EU has found itself in the immediate need of getting alternative gas suppliers as soon as possible and reducing the dependency on Russian gas, and at the same time trying to deny Putin the massive revenues that could be used to finance his war in Ukraine. So Europe has turned its eyes back south and has re-engaged massively with North African countries to substitute those fossil fuels. And there has been strong contact with Algeria, but also Egypt has grown in importance in terms of gas supply. And we have seen all the EU heads of states and governments traveling to Algiers and Cairo to sign deals to secure new gas supply, and in a certain way also competing among themselves, outbidding each other. But overall, the Maghreb countries cannot in themselves completely substitute Russian gas, because there are limits in terms of production capacity. The ability to transfer it through pipelines is also on the European side that there's only a certain amount of LNG that can be processed. So they are playing a very, very strong part, but they're not the only one that have been engaged by the European Union.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about Algeria, because I think certainly the question about capacity has been a big question since the very beginning of sort of these redesigned plans to try and increase Algerian gas import particularly. And I think that's worked well for certain countries like Italy, where we've seen sort of a shift in percentages from what Italy was importing from Algeria prior to what they are importing this year, and what they're also hoping to import next year. But I want to think a little bit right now about, maybe have your thoughts also on how does this play out also in terms of the long-term relationship, right? So Europe is facing this kind of dichotomy where they have current needs, more gas needs to be imported, but also future needs, which point more towards energy transition. And how does that relationship with Algeria play in light of these sort of competing priorities, or sort of this push and pull on the European side?
Yeah, Algeria is probably the most emblematic example of the gap you just highlighted about the needs that Europe has now and the perspective of a green transition later on in the future. And it is emerging significantly in the dealing with Algeria, because what we are seeing is Europe basically insisting on gas supply, trying to secure as much gas as possible at the moment, even though Algeria hasn't significantly increased its production. Actually, it's been rather stagnant. But on the other side, it's trying to convey a message that is, well, we need your gas now, but in the future, not really. We would need more renewables, which is extremely difficult in engaging with Algeria, because the overall political structure and the Algerian elites are rather keen on getting the maximum revenues they can get out of gas, and they have a long history of delaying the green transition. So there is a significant gap between what Europe wants from Algeria, which is starting a green transition as soon as possible, because it takes a lot of time to be effective. And on the other side, is Algeria is much more concerned with the immediate needs, and it also trying to get European countries subscribing long-term contracts that include deliveries of gas for 10 to 15 years, because that is a guarantee of external revenues that are extremely important to kind of keeping the overall political system of Algeria together, in the sense that the country is rather prisoner of a rentier state logic and tends to use the revenues from oil and gas, especially gas, to support subsidies to keep the population quiet. And this is problematic because it prevents investments, slows down innovation, and it does not provide a lot of incentives turning towards a green transition.
And one of the things, if I can just drill down on this question of infrastructure that you mentioned and some of the obstacles to increasing production, even over the short period, I think Sonatrach has made some promises this year and next year in terms of ramping up production. But what we have is sort of basically a lack of investment in infrastructure. And what we are seeing right now is maybe some of the potential contracts and some of the agreements that are being reached, I think, point to a little bit more willingness on the side of European investors and European companies to invest a bit more in that sort of Algerian infrastructure. Is that an accurate kind of characterization? And what does that say, again, about the need to sort of move away from gas and oil extraction and more towards green energy?
It is a rather accurate picture, the one you just described, because Algeria is trying to convey this message to European partner, insisting that if they want to get Algerian gas, they also have to participate in investing in the gas infrastructure, in the extraction capability. Also because the gas industry in Algeria has faced a long period of underinvestment. Also because in the past, the messages that the European Union was giving to Algeria were not focused too much on fossil fuels, because the transition is more important. This poses a big problem in terms of the European engagement to Algeria, because on one side there are immediate needs that has to be satisfied, and on the other part there's a need to provide a significant incentive, which should be both economic but also political, to the country to embark in a transition. Because what Algeria has been doing in the past is basically been trying to kick the can on the road as much as possible and delaying the transition, because the revenues of gas were much more important. And also in terms of the state of the infrastructure in Algeria is problematic. We have high rate of flaring. We have a lot of leakages in the pipelines. And so investments are needed even to maintain the current level of transport capacity, because the infrastructure needs a major upgrade. The more so if European countries want to have more gas in the future. But there is last point here. The thing is that European countries are not very willing to embark on this infrastructural expenditure, because there's a risk they will find themselves with stranded assets, having invested billions of euros in pipelines or extraction capacities that in 10 years' time probably would not be profitable at all and would not be used up to their capacity.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe just one last point on CBAM, which I think Europe is getting ready to sort of finalize and adopt this year, I believe. Does that add another kind of obstacle to the relationship, or not really?
It does, and not only because, of course, there's a signaling that European is driving more strongly towards sustainable energies, but also because of the fact that supply of energy is one part, but in perspective, Europe would like also to nearshore some of manufacturing production from other areas of the world to the Mediterranean because it's closer. They can have shorter and more resilient supply chains, but if Algeria produces goods using gas, transporting them on high emission vehicles and so on, they would be heavily impacted by the common border adjustment mechanism. They would face significant tariffs when entering the union. So this nearshoring perspective would not work unless the Algerian economy is largely powered by renewables.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to talking a little bit more about renewables later, but I want to talk just about, kind of spend a few minutes looking at Libya, because that's a producer with huge potential. The National Oil Corporation plans to ramp up oil production in the next few years. And there's also a lot of optimism about further oil discoveries as well. But of course, there are still major political and governance challenges that the country is facing. This is still a country that's contested between two sort of competing power structures. But the Libyan NOC has repeatedly urged European and foreign oil and gas partners to resume exploration and production, assuring them that the security situation is improving in the country. My question to you, Alberto, is how does the EU sort of balance the risk with the potential when it comes to Libya and Libyan energy sector?
Well, I would say that while the situation in Libya has in fact been improving recently, from the European Union perspective, the risk still far outweighs the potential benefit in the sense that they do not deem the political and security conditions on the ground as suitable to go back to the country and invest significantly in the energy sector. To put it more broadly, the European Union's idea is generally that political issues should be solved first, and then there could be an economic engagement with investment in the oil and gas infrastructure, because there is a fear that a contract that would be signed today, tomorrow could be void, or with no government able to enforce the conditions of those contracts. And on other areas of the country, there's a fear that it's not safe enough to operate for European personnel and technicians. So at the moment, Europe is still very, very wary of investing in Libya. I'm afraid that unless this political process improves, Europeans are not going back to the country. On the other side, it's important to note that Europe remains strongly committed to the Libyan political process, and it wants to play a part in bringing the two sides of the country together and trying to foster a government of national unity, because in the past, even in the recent periods of crisis, when there has been a government with enough recognition, enough legitimacy, and enough control of the country, actually talks of returning and reinvesting in oil and gas have been present. So it's viewed as sort of a precondition to go back to invest in the country.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the sort of the green energy and the EU's role in helping kind of support green energy, and how Maghreb countries themselves kind of approach this idea of green energy. And I think there is a huge variety, right? So, looking at Morocco, for example, Morocco has been one of the early partners in this track. Morocco has been talking about renewables for a long time. First and foremost, to address some of their domestic needs and just kind of the heavy financial burden that importing energy has put on the budget. And then, of course, also, just kind of to signal their support and their dedication to sustainability. And the country has been, designing sustainability roadmaps, discussing climate initiatives and engaging on climate initiatives with international finance institutions. They've been heavily featured in COP22, really just kind of trying to claim the mantle of a leader in Africa's green transition. Talk a little bit about how the EU features as a partner or as a supporter, or more importantly, as an investor in Morocco's plans for renewable energy, green energy, particularly the deal that was signed recently between Morocco and the EU. I think it was in October. And what does that entail for all of these industries that Morocco is trying to build around renewable energy and energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, Morocco is viewed also by the European Union as a sort of green energy champion in the region, and as the country that can set the example, both in terms of what the other actors the region could do, but also in terms of which kind of partnership can be built by the European Union with those countries. So, in a certain way, this like positive attitude is confirmed from the European Union side. The country has engaged sooner than the others in green energy, and it is considered the most promising in terms of opportunities, especially for what concerns not just green energy but also green hydrogen, and most importantly, because that's a part that is present in the deals that have been signed and also on the European Union talks, is that Morocco is already being targeted with investments in other sectors of industry, mostly the automotive and the textile ones, profiting from the fact that a large part of the energy mix of Morocco is coming from renewables, and also is kind of a country where this nearshoring we talked about before can actually happen. So it's somehow seen as a land of opportunity by European firms in terms of where they can relocate some of their production in a country that has a population with good skills, good education, and that is largely committed to this green transition. On the other side, of course, this means that the European Union has somehow overlooked certain other features of Morocco. An example is the Western Sahara dispute, with Spain supporting Rabat and in turn Algeria cutting some of the gas which is now flowing towards Italy. So it's not a honeymoon, this kind of relationship, but it's generally considered rather positive from the European Union side, and there's a willingness to engage more and more with Morocco.
Mm-hmm. But let me just ask a quick follow-up question on what you mentioned. And this is something that you brought up early on when you talked a little bit about some of the internal competition within the EU for Algerian gas. My understanding, and correct me here if I'm wrong, is that Algeria is still able to meet its commitments to Spain, while at the same time increasing its commitment to Italy. The point is that promises for future percentages have changed. Is that the same situation? And more broadly, can you reflect a little bit on this division within the EU for not just Algerian gas, but also sort of this race to who gets to secure their domestic needs first? And where does that leave EU institutions in terms of planning a little bit more long term?
I mean, there's also the point that Algeria has increased the prices they expect for the gas supply to Spain. So, and at the same time, Italy has profited from this kind of row between Spain and Algeria because it was able to get higher promises in terms of future gas commitment. So what we are seeing is that instead of having a common energy policy, European countries have largely gone each one on its own, trying to get before all the others to Maghreb countries and also in other areas of the world, and trying to get a deal signed as soon as possible so that they would secure this kind of this gas supply that other countries arriving later would not be able to get. This has been extremely problematic, something that the Commission has signaled as a problem, especially in relation to the future, and it has strengthened the instruments to go for joint gas purchases apparently from this spring, when the reserves have to be filled back after the winter. But again, how this would play out with the member states is somehow problematic, in the sense that there is a strong interest by single countries to make sure that they have certain kind of gas, even if that comes at the expense of their neighbors. So what has to be done in this regard is also providing significant incentives for countries to agree to joint purchases. We would see if this plays out correctly in spring, but at the moment, what we have seen so far doesn't really bode well on that.
One of the interesting things in our conversation, I think that's very emblematic also of the conversation about renewables and the green transition, is that you have to kind of keep going back to talk about gas and then renewables and green energy, and it's definitely not a linear process. But one of the points about green hydrogen, is that there's a lot of enthusiasm in the EU about it as a source of renewable energy, is almost sort of this magic solution to the climate crisis in the long term. But you and I have had conversations in the past about maybe the potential that there is a big overestimation here of what that means, particularly when you look at the plans and the feasibility and the transport and such. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the sort of vision versus the reality, and where does that leave the transition again?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Europe, as you said, is still pretty much in the hype phase regarding hydrogen, where everything related to green hydrogen is seen as extremely beneficial. And this kind of enthusiasm often puts the difficulties that exist somehow in the background, but they would face. I mean, don't get me wrong, green hydrogen is a powerful instrument to support the green transition in Europe, but it is not a silver bullet. It's important if applied in the right sector, but it is an energy source that is still costly. It is complex to manage, to transport, and also to produce. So while Maghreb countries have been considered the primary source by the European Union as a primary source of green hydrogen in the future, and actually the EU is planning to rely on imports of green hydrogen to cover half of its demand from 2030 onwards, and a large part of those imports would be coming from the Maghreb countries. We need to make sure that the roadmaps on hydrogen production are actually feasible and are not just very nice lines written on papers. And a lot of it also relies on development in the technology or in particular processes now are costly and they are forecast to become competitive in the future, but also a lot would depend on what would happen to gas. Would it be cheaper, or would it be made more expensive because of taxes or subsidies towards green hydrogen to make it cheaper? So there's a complex picture that needs to be worked out effectively before relying significantly on green hydrogen.
Another dimension to this discussion, Alberto, is the ethical considerations of exporting, hydrogen or renewable energy more generally to Europe versus domestic consumption to try and displace domestic fossil fuel power generation and mitigate some of the impact on climate change. And I want to talk about that because we've spent a lot of time talking about governments. We've spent a lot of time talking about policies. We've spent good time talking about feasibility, short-term, long-term, how one sort of undermines the other. But I want to get a sense from you of, how does the EU view this ethical question of a lot of these countries that are looking, and I'm thinking here about Morocco, that are looking to their renewable energy as maybe potentially serving a big export factor while they continue to burn fossil fuel, while Morocco continues to burn quite a bit of coal. Sure, I think the percentages and green energy or renewable energy over the course of the years has come to take a big part of domestic electricity production, but the country still relies heavily on coal. And I'm wondering, what is the view within the EU of this potential concern? To what extent is the EU looking to help kind of encourage these countries to meet some of their domestic needs before we talk about export? What are some of the stumbling blocks that we are looking at when we try to think about this question of export versus domestic consumption?
You're touching a very salient issue here, although I'm afraid that the debate within Europe at the time is not really well developed on the issue, in the sense that ethical concerns and problems related to the medium-term consequences of that are somehow put back at the moment, which is a really problematic point, in the sense that in order to produce green hydrogen, you need to have a lot of spare capacity in terms of renewables, which means renewable electricity you're not going to use to fuel your domestic needs. The risk is that those countries, in order to meet this kind of quota that the European Union have asked for, would just keep burning, as you said, fossils, which would just push the emissions a bit further away, but they are still there. So that is problematic on an ethical point of view, is problematic on an economical point of view, and it is also problematic in terms of the effect on the climate, of course. So what should be among the guidelines from European Union perspective is trying to accompany its countries into this transition, making sure that this surplus energy exists and is there in order to meet both the growing internal demand, because if we consider that the population is growing in Morocco, in Algeria, in Egypt especially, so consumption is going to grow. Then there's also a switch to electrification in order to reduce emission, which also increases the demand for electricity. And if this kind of demand is not met by renewables, the risk is that we end up burning more coal or gas that in the time might have become even cheaper. So there would be even an economic case for those countries to just burn gas or coal. That is one of the most significant concerns that has to be addressed, because otherwise we're just putting emissions 1,000 kilometers back south, but they will be still there. And this allows me to point another thing, is that while we always believe that green energies, renewables kind of break the long-held assumptions and logics that have characterized the relationship between country and fossil fuels, this is not necessarily always the case, in the sense that, yes, renewables are decentralized, but as we are discussing now, there's a lot of dynamics that might be present again if the relationship is not thought through from the very beginning. So that is probably what the European Union should be doing more than in the past, focusing more on the electricity potential and renewable output of those countries before agreeing to certain quotas of hydrogen for export, because there's a risk that otherwise they would be met just by burning coal for other needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, explain that a little bit more. Explain, what is it that the EU could be doing? But there's certainly the question of investment, right, and support and financial support, and that's been a big issue that's come out, over the past few years, is that a lot of the pledges are not met, or the financing for some of those pledges doesn't come through. But what else are you thinking in terms of what the EU could do to address some of these dynamics that you are describing?
Financing is just a part of it, because it's not enough to put the money. A lot the European Union can do is on sharing its know-how, on providing technical skills in terms of how to manage the electrical grid, for example, which I know it sounds very boring to talk about electrical grids, but they play a very big part. Algeria has, for example, an electrical grid is in a rather sorry state even to meet current needs. So what the European Union can do is not stopping at providing a target and the initial investment money to reach it, but engaging continuously with Maghreb countries, sharing its know-how, its technological processes in order to simplify the transition of those countries and making sure they can actually meet the ambitions in renewable production. Because if they just stop at providing the resources with little oversight or little sharing of the technical skills, the risk is that it would just stop or it could be derailed.
Yeah, that's a really important and interesting point, Alberto, but I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there for today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. I want to thank our guest, Alberto Rizzi, for joining us today, and our production team, particularly Haneen Zaghlem, for her work on researching and producing this episode. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. For more on North Africa and Sahel content, please check out our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletter for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Intissar Fakir, and this has been Middle East Focus.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.